If you're a county commissioner and you introduce a resolution calling vaccine passports Jim Crow 2.0, you can probably bet that's not going to go over well.
Making that comparison is incredibly painful.
Decades and decades of people have been hurt.
I will not tolerate the language of this resolution.
And it doesn't help that there's already a recall campaign against you for racist Facebook posts. Nevertheless, Mark Shull is doubling down.
It is devoid of bigotry and racism. I will not be censored.
Also, remember the guy from Indiana who was charged with throwing Molotov cocktails at police during protests in Portland? Well, apparently, he briefly got out of jail thanks to a grassroots group who fundraised to cover his bail. Here's the story. Good evening and welcome to The Story. I'm Maggie Vespa. Dan Haggerty is off this week. He'll be back next week. In the meantime, the rest remains the same. All the ways to contact us are at the bottom of your screen. You can email thestory@kgw.com, reach out on social media, use that hashtag HeyDan, do all the things, okay? Because as you'll see, your questions, your comments, all the things that you have to say to us, they drive this show. And on that note, let's get right to it, okay? Let's get to our big story because, hoo boy, did we get a big response to last night's big story. A lot of bigs. It was on Oregon's vaccine passport policy and one county's mission to declare itself a sanctuary from that policy. Actually, a viewer flagged us on this story as well. Thanks to that viewer. Today, Clackamas County commissioners were set to hear a proposed resolution banning businesses from checking your vaccine status like the state requires. And to make the point, the draft resolution in its text compared vaccine passports to Jim Crow laws, aka decades of government-sanctioned, nay, government-enforced segregation in the United States. The draft actually called vaccine passports, as you can see in the super at the bottom of your screen, Jim Crow 2.0. So cue the viewer comments. Mickey wrote, Jim Crow 2.0, really? Beyond bizarre. Charlie wrote, that kind of far-right hyperbole degrades the public discourse. Josh, and we did get some of these, tweeted, so proud of Clackamas County. Let's go, Tootie Smith. Let's pass this. Tootie Smith, by the way, is the Clackamas County Board Chair. And then finally, Patty, we thought, summed up all the feedback nicely. I read this on last night's show, but I want to show it to you again. She wrote, to the board, we vote. Always. Thank you all for writing in. Now, we said last night we had reached out to all the commissioners for any kind of explanation, like who wrote this? Who typed out a legal document equating being asked to keep your mask on should you choose not to get the vaccine with legalized, oppressive, violent racism? How in the world did this legal official document get on the board's public agenda? And as of last night, as you saw, we hadn't heard back. But today, we got an earful, starting with that meeting. It was this morning. And in the meeting, it was revealed that Commissioner Mark Shull was the one behind this draft resolution, and he flat out doubled down multiple times. So here's some of what he said.
There's nothing in there that should be construed as coming from a racist perspective. In fact, I would submit that the people in this county of color, would be the most against civil restriction based by a passport, and that they will understand what I'm referring to. The reference to Jim Crow laws has nothing to do with racism. It has to do with the restriction of civil liberties based on a law from a state. It was intended to cause transparency and discussion. That's what I'm here for. I represent the people who elected me, and that's what I'm going to do, irregardless of what the other board members say. I will not be censored.
Okay, so that was Mark Shull, uncensored. And according to County Chair Tootie Smith, no other commissioner saw the draft of that ordinance before Shull officially introduced it. So Smith and her colleagues each spoke several times, saying they were appalled by what is written in that draft.
It's obvious that Commissioner Shull does not understand that comparing a requirement to wear a mask if you are unvaccinated to the destruction and devastation that the Jim Crow laws, what occurred. People could not attend certain places. It led to arrests if you used a water fountain that wasn't designated. It led to lynchings. It led to death. Making that comparison is incredibly painful, not only for communities of color, but for our entire community.
Decades and decades of people have been hurt and have been marginalized. And there are certain things that you don't bring up in certain conversations because of those people that have been impacted. And in Clackamas County, we are an open county to everyone.
I'm sorry you do not understand the effect that words have on people. Words mean substance. Now, rightfully so, I agree that passports are not the way to go, and I do not think vaccines should be mandatory. It is still a choice. And I will fight for that right as long as I'm here. But I will not tolerate from anybody, including you, sir, the language of this resolution. It will not proceed today. It is dead.
So, two big takeaways from today's meeting. As you heard, number one, that resolution is dead. It's done. The board made that clear. Number two, you heard Shull earlier declare that he will not be censored. Well, there's a reason that he said that at that time. In short, as a result of this proposed draft, the board voted today to strip Commissioner Mark Shull of all of his what's called liaison duties. So what does that mean? Well, in Clackamas County, each commissioner acts as an official kind of board representative, working with fellow officials or community groups on different issues, things like housing and homelessness, emergency preparedness, official things, and so on. Commissioner Shull's assignments included, we're told, among others, the Fair Board and the Veterans Committee. Not anymore. His fellow commissioners said they basically don't trust him to behave respectfully and essentially not say anything racist while on those jobs. And it's not just because of what happened this week. You might remember back in January, a constituent dug up a bunch of posts from Shull's Facebook page. The posts were racist and Islamophobic. The entire board and community leaders across Clackamas County called on Shull to resign. And at that point, he refused. And then on that point, voters even tried to recall him. But here's the thing, Shull is actually newly elected, and they learned they had to wait 6 months. More on that in a minute. Even Chair Tootie Smith condemned the post, and this was just a couple of months after she went on Fox News on Tucker Carlson and said that being forced to follow COVID protocols equated to being treated as, quote, second-rate slaves. So yeah, there's a lot of layers to this story. So fast forward to today, and Commissioner Shull is a focus yet again. And again, his fellow commissioners are blasting him, and one of them, Commissioner Sonia Fisher, agreed to hop on Zoom right after today's meeting and talk to us about this.
Let me be very clear. I'm here today to let you know and your viewers know that previous comments like Chair Tootie Smith made comparing mask requirements to being a second-rate slave, or currently Commissioner Shull comparing vaccine verification to Jim Crow laws, do not represent the views of Clackamas County residents. Clackamas County residents are good people. They're welcoming. They value diversity.
Is racism a problem on the Clackamas County Board of Commissioners?
Yes, I do think that racism is a problem on the Board of Clackamas County Commissioners. The brazenness of Commissioner Shull thinking that he could propose an ordinance that calls for the similarity between Jim Crow, which is extreme discrimination against people of color, and a requirement to wear masks if you're not vaccinated, only happens in a world where people are comfortable with extreme politics. Our system is broken, and it's really unfortunate.
Blunt question. We're checking back in with the recall effort for Commissioner Shull. Do you support him being recalled?
I support the voters of Clackamas County exercising their right to have the representatives that they want. I believe that if the voters would have known the truth about Mark Shull's racism and bigotry, they would not have elected him.
All right, a final note on this piece. We have reached out multiple times, but Commissioner Mark Shull has not gotten back to us. So, Commissioner, if you're watching, we would love to hear from you. My email is in your inbox. You can reach out that way or just email us directly, our entire team, at thestory@kgw.com. We would love to hear from you, but especially because, sir, the people working to recall you, they have gotten back to us, and they say they're working, quote, very hard to make that happen this summer when that 6 months is up. And their full statement brings us to our quote of the day. Commissioner Shull's current actions are only making our job easier, end quote. Again, let us know what you think about this story. Reach out using that hashtag, HeyDan. All right, so on that note, let's count some vaccines, shall we? We love this segment. More than 2.32 million Oregonians have gotten at least their first dose of the vaccine, and that puts us at 66% of the state's adult population. We're getting so close. In Washington, more than 4.32 million people have gotten at least their first dose, which works out to more than 69% of the state's adult population. And I make that weird voice and face because both states are waiting, look at that, to get to 70% before they fully reopen. And sticking with vaccines, let's answer some of your questions now about Oregon's vaccine lottery. We'll start with Steve. He asked, with vets not being counted in the lottery, does it mean they're also excluded from the 70%? Great question, Steve. Thank you. So in this case, veterans actually are being counted toward the 70% vaccination goal to get the state to reopen. That's because that 70% counts everyone. It includes the shots given at the VA and the vaccines given by the tribes. And that's because it uses information coming from the CDC, which is tracking all of the shots given, states, feds, everything. And a lot of you also had questions, kind of staying on the same lane here, about being eligible for the lottery if you got your vaccine from a federal site. So remember, if you got your vaccine from the VA or from most of the tribes, right now, you're not eligible for the lottery, and that's because those shots came from the federal government's store of vaccines and not from the states, and that means they're not being tracked by the state of Oregon. Now, the state says it is working to try and fix that problem so that those people, and there are thousands of them, can be entered into the lottery. But Tracy had a really good question. She asked, hey, Dan, my daughter and son-in-law got vaccines through the federal site in Jackson County. Are they included in this lottery? Again, Tracy, thank you. So in this case, pay attention to where you got the vaccine or where your loved ones got the vaccine. If it's what's called a federally qualified health center, then yes, you are included in the lottery. You can see that from that list, this list here, there are a lot of them in the state of Oregon. And basically, these are clinics and health centers that get money from the federal government, but the governor's office says those vaccines are tracked in the state's database. Great questions. All right, let's switch gears again and talk about Portland's protests. Here's some video that you might remember from last summer. This was pretty big at the time. Someone threw a Molotov cocktail into a crowd, and that crowd included a group of police officers. You can see the fire. Well, an Indiana man already charged with attempted aggravated murder in this case now faces federal charges. Malik Mohammed appeared in federal court today on explosives charges. The FBI arrested the 24-year-old on Friday after he had been released from custody on the state charges. And a note here, a group called the Portland Freedom Fund had posted his bail in this case. They had to raise 10% of his more than $2 million bail, which came out to about $212,000.
Okay, on that note, let's bring in KGW's Kyle Aboshi, who's been following this case. So Kyle, I mean, there's a lot here, but first and foremost, who is this group and how did they come up with that much money?
The group is called the Portland Freedom Fund, and according to its organization, let me read, it's dedicated to reducing harms perpetuated against our Black, Brown, and Indigenous neighbors by the criminal justice system through posting bail so they may navigate their case from a position of freedom. The fund is supported through donations largely driven through social media, and the fund president tells the Oregonian it's posted bail for about 100 people since the beginning of last year.
Interesting. Okay, so back to the investigation. How did investigators figure out, especially in the chaos of these protests and these riots, how did they figure out that this was their suspect?
The investigation is fairly involved, and a lot of it is laid out in court papers. One clue that's really interesting, though, involved a Goodwill price tag. It was found on a growler used as a Molotov cocktail, according to investigators. Police, they subpoenaed the records from Goodwill, including surveillance video, which showed Muhammad and his girlfriend buying the growlers along with baseball bats, and then credit card records also backed that up.
Wow, super interesting. Okay, last question for you. This guy's from Indiana. I mean, so what do we know about how he ended up here?
According to his mother, who I spoke with several weeks ago, Muhammad came to Portland last summer to join in the protest. Prior to that, he'd been organizing events in Indiana and eventually even made headlines for hugging a police lieutenant and met privately with Indiana's governor. But prosecutors say his intent in coming to Portland was more violent than that. They say they recovered guns in a trailer he was living in. Also, he posted really threatening messages on social media as well.
All right. A lot to follow in this case. Kyla Boshi, we appreciate all the updates. Thank you so much. Tell me if this sounds familiar.
A quorum is apparently not present.
Yep. It looks like Democrats in Texas are taking a page out of Oregon Republicans' playbook.
For lawmakers to simply walk out like this, it's not the norm in Texas.
When the story continues.
Man, I said it at the top, I'll say it again. Hoo boy, are we getting a lot of comments about our topics tonight and last night, quite frankly. So, welcome back. We always go through your tweets and your emails during the show. Like during the break, I run over and I check my cell. And you guys have such great ideas and such great questions. So keep them coming and use that hashtag #HeyDan. And, I also want to remind everybody, let's take a moment here and talk about our Hey Help campaign to give back to the community. And this week, we're asking you to consider donating to the Boys and Girls Clubs of Portland Metro. They work to empower more than 6,400 young people each year through after school and summer programs. And we're calling this, by the way, a micro donation drive. So feel free to give any amount, no matter how small. Now, Now, I really want to focus, or I should say, I know we don't focus much on national news on this show, but we're going to now. We want to now because we want to talk about what's happening in Texas specifically. And the reason is it will probably sound pretty familiar to those of you who follow politics here in Oregon. And a lot of you have written to us about this. In fact, a viewer named John emailed us a link to this story with the headline, "Dems Walk and Stop Texas GOP's Sweeping Voting Restrictions." And John also said, guess it works both ways. Dan kept reporting about the GOP of Oregon, but looks like Dems do the same thing in Texas. And he's absolutely right. So let's take a look now at what's going on in Texas. So Republicans there basically drew up what's become a very controversial voting bill that would do things like limit early voting hours, ban drive-through voting, make it a crime to send out mail-in ballot applications, not the ballots, the applications, all things that millions of voters in Texas used this last election. And Democrats obviously were not happy with this bill, but they are the minority in Texas, and they didn't have enough votes to kill the bill flat out. So they did something that, yes, we have seen the Oregon GOP do quite a few times. They walked out right before a midnight deadline, effectively killing the bill by denying a quorum. Like I said, it sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? So I spoke with Ashley Godot. She's the political anchor at our sister station in Austin, Texas, and we talked about how this tactic is being used there. Here in Oregon, we've been through walkouts before. This is something that has happened almost every session over the last few years. And we had viewers writing in saying, hey, you covered Oregon's walkout in depth, and now we're seeing this happening in Texas. And oh, by the way, it's the Democrats, not the Republicans. Can I just ask you, how rare is this? I mean, has this happened before? And you've been covering politics in Texas for a while. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I have been covering politics for a while. I've never seen this happen. This is not the norm in Texas. This is incredibly rare, and partly because the timing just doesn't allow for it. But because this, priority bill was down to the last day, the last hour before it could possibly pass, we saw this sort of perfect storm that would allow a walkout to happen to kill such legislation. Normally, really important bills aren't reserved for the last day, the last hour, and so that's why this, one, doesn't happen, but two, for lawmakers to simply walk out like this, it's not the norm in Texas.
Can I ask you, and I know this just happened, so it's kind of like asking somebody who just finished a marathon when they want to run their next race, but we talked pretty quickly in Oregon about, oh man, is this going to be a tactic that's used again? And it was. Have you heard any talk in these divisive times about, well, I guess this is something that we're going to do now, because clearly it worked on this bill that is so divisive and everybody feels so strongly about?
Well, the Democrats are not necessarily proud that they did this. They saw this as the last way for them to fight to kill legislation that they believed was going to silence the voices of millions of Texans at the ballot box. This is not something that they necessarily wanted to do. Texas lawmakers pride themselves on being able to reach across the aisle and work to pass bills. So I don't think, or at least I would hope, that this is not going to be something that we see often in Texas. It's important to note the governor is also talking about penalizing lawmakers for doing this. He tweeted that he is going to veto Article 10 of our state budget. That's the article that funds the legislative branch. So there's still a lot of questions about how exactly that's going to work, because it not only pays lawmakers, but pays the entire Capitol staff. But I don't think that this is going to be something that we see over and over again.
Yeah, fingers crossed for you. Our thanks to Ashley, by the way. We really appreciate her take. So here in Oregon, of course, again, we have seen this happen over and over again. And this session, Democrats are pushing four bills to try and put a stop to the walkouts. They would, number one, fine lawmakers for walking out and make it so they can't use donations to pay for any fines or expenses that they get from walking out. They want to disqualify lawmakers from holding office if they have too many unexcused absences, and they want to change the quorum requirement to a simple majority instead of a 2/3 majority, which is what we have now. Now, the catch-22 is Republicans would actually have to show up for these bills to get a vote. It's quite the hitch there. We haven't seen any movement on these since March, it's also worth noting, but we will obviously keep you posted. All right, so this week marks 100 years since one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. It's the Tulsa race massacre. You probably heard a lot about it this week. So we want to take a minute and talk about what happened.
Between May 31st and June 1st, 1921, a white supremacist mob raged through the Greenwood community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was a thriving black community known as Black Wall Street. They set fire to nearly every building, including a dozen churches, 5 hotels, 31 restaurants, 4 drugstores, 8 doctor's offices, more than 24 grocery stores, and the Black Library. As many as 300 people were killed, 10,000 were left homeless, and one of the country's most prosperous black communities was burned to the ground, never to return. For years, the massacre went unknown to the general public. There's no record of exactly how many people died or what happened to their bodies, who were the white perpetrators, or what exactly happened to the man who was the catalyst for the massacre. The Washington Post has a profile on him that we think is worth your time, because it turns out he may have fled to the Oregon coast. The man's name was Dick Rowland. He was a black teenager accused of attacking a white teenage girl, and that's what set off the mob. She later recanted her story and disappeared from the area. As for Rowland, according to the Washington Post, he was able to get out of Tulsa during the massacre and eventually found work in shipyards on the Oregon coast. A family friend says he may have been killed in a port explosion in the 1960s. But his name doesn't appear in records of the explosion because he likely had changed his name by then.
All right, so again, on this day, 100 years later, we just wanted to point that article out. Again, it's in the Washington Post. Possible tie between the Tulsa race massacre and the Oregon coast. Crazy to think about. All right, again, we've been reading your comments and your questions, all the suggestions that you have, all the thoughts that you have on our big story tonight. Keep them coming. Use that hashtag HeyDan on social media, and we'll read some of them when we finish the story next. We have time for one question. Peggy had a great one. Wonder why someone else on the board, the Clackamas County Board of Commissioners, didn't review what Shull wrote before it was submitted. That is a great question. The chair, Tootie Smith, did address it. She said basically she's been kind of having, in her words, a liberal policy and letting commissioners just submit things with minimal vetting. She did say that Commissioner Shull bypassed whatever vetting measures they had in place, which she lambasted him for. But she also said that she wants to review that policy now because clearly this weekend they learned a lesson. By the way, we have the full raw chunk of that meeting that pertains to the resolution we talked about up on our YouTube channel right now. It's about half an hour. It is well worth your time. Thank you for joining us here on The Story. The news at 6:30 with Laurel Porter is up next.